Welcome everyone to our webinar. I'm Alexandra, and today is a Global Accessibility Awareness Day. Our topic is crucial for email marketing. It's accessibility. Accessibility in email marketing isn't just an additional feature, it's a fundamental right. With 27% of the population living with some form of disability, ensuring accessible digital content is both a civil rights issue and a significant opportunity for inclusive engagement. That's why today we invited Sarah Gallardo from Oracle to join us. Sarah is a lead email developer and email accessible specialist. With over 12 years of experience in coding emails and more than 6 years dedicated to email accessibility, Sarah is a true expert in this field. Hi, Sarah.
Hi, how's it going? Excited to be here.
Thank you. So in this session, led by Dmytro Kudrenko, founder and CEO of Stripe, Sarah will share her extensive experience and valuable insights of creating emails that are not only captivating, but also accessible to everyone. So let's start. Dmytro, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Alexandra. Hello, Sarah. Thank you for joining us today. I want to say that I have noticed an interesting trend that people rarely dream of becoming email marketing. And yet they often come for very diverse backgrounds and then fall in love with it. For example, in the last session, it was Mark Robbins. He was a musician. Casper transitioned from a web designer. I started as a computer science engineer. How did you find your way into email marketing and stay for 12 years?
That's fair. So I started as a graphic designer and turned to web development the same way I think everyone did about 15 years ago. And just kind of kept finding email roles. And then once I started, I just kept finding more and more email roles. So it just kind of worked from there. But for me, I think email became really personal during the recession here in the US. Because I was a single parent and I was desperate to find a job, and that was kind of my inlet into official email work. I was at a recruiter's office back when you went into offices, and she was really bored through the whole conversation. I'm doing this interview and I'm trying to get a job, right? I'm selling everything that I can possibly think of. And then as she was basically shooing me out the door, I'm like, oh, email, I've done email. And she's like, what's that? Email? You know how to do email? And then the jobs just kept coming. And so email really kind of saved the day for me during a pretty rough time. So it was kind of a really big, amazing start to kind of being in email.
Yeah, great. But you saw email marketing for 12 years. What you found, your impression, how email marketing changed it, how your work is changed in these 12 years?
Oh, I mean, it's changed a lot. I mean, I still remember when the iPhone came out and we had to start coding for responsive. I feel like that was a really big shift. I think email before and after responsive development was just hugely different. And then, let's see, I'm trying to think of a more recent trend. I think as we've gotten to more segmentation and personalization, I think that has also been a huge shift. Obviously, I think accessibility is a huge shift that I think is hopefully gaining momentum and continuing to expand, and people are starting to focus more on that, which I think is great. But yeah, it's also weird coming from email being a kind of job no one heard of, I remember, and I'm sure there's plenty of people in your audience, oh, so you make spam, was the response. And then I think after a while it became more validated in the kind of broader community. It became more of a proper business tool, which it always was, but I think it just took people a while to kind of the general population a while to see it. Yeah. And then we had the whole email is dead phase. Yeah.
Yeah. Have this badge, everybody who doesn't know what is email marketing do, like it's you who send in a spam.
Mhm.
Okay, again, I have to explain what I'm doing.
You're right.
Sometimes it's easy to say, okay, yeah, it was me. But, you know, I found in your LinkedIn very interesting post where you wrote, it's a quote, uh, so much of being a good email developer is communicating complicated things. Can you
Mhm.
share some like techniques, methods, advice, how to explain all this? It's really complicated stuff to
Mhm.
like your teammates and other non-technical guys.
Let's see. So it's gotten a little easier once I started working in agencies, like bigger agencies, because everyone I'm interacting with knows about email, so I don't have to explain as much. But I still think the way that I've found that has been most helpful is more in the like um, kind of finding things that are related or like similar to kind of talk about to kind of have a almost like a allegory of, you know, building a house. Sometimes I'll kind of use that one as a way of kind of explaining, you know, the importance of having kind of structural foundation and kind of using tried and true methods versus there's a lot of really cool stuff you can do. But is that like, would you want to sleep in that house after if, you know, or through a hurricane or whatever? So I think that usually is kind of my tried and true way of kind of explaining things. But when we're talking about accessibility specifically, that gets a little more complicated. But I like to kind of keep the focus on the user that needs these accessibility tools. So talking about people who are using Zoom tools and that being so important to have kind of a very flexible design that can kind of be zoomed into or zoomed out of, and really kind of talking more about that experience because I think a lot of people are really kind of don't know what they don't know, if that makes sense. So I think we have kind of an idea of what someone that uses a screen reader is like, but the reality of that is sometimes different than what we expect.
Yeah, by the way, it's interesting. Uh, tell me your very short your story into accessibility because it's not very popular trend. Every email, every communication, everything has to be accessible. But
Mhm.
what is your journey? I know it's could be a kind of pretty personal thing for you.
Yeah, it was. So, my youngest daughter was diagnosed with dyslexia when she was 9. And through the kind of process of kind of trying to help her get comfortable with herself, we ended up trying a lot of assistive technologies. And one of the assistive technologies that she tried was a screen reader, um, technically a text to speech program. But I had just finished an email. I think I was doing something tricky and I was really excited about it. So I like wanted to see what it sounded like on a screen reader. And of course, it sounded absolutely horrible. So I then just kind of kept that in my head. I honestly didn't do a whole lot with it right in that moment because there was just kind of a lot of else going on. If you've ever had a kid who's diagnosed with a learning disability, that's a pretty full time job for a while. But then started really kind of playing with it and working with things. And then as she became more invested in the her kind of journey as a dyslexic student, we joined with a nonprofit locally here in Denver that has a kind of focus on self advocacy, and so she started getting involved with the self advocacy group, and then also kind of the process of meeting with her teachers and stuff like that required a lot of advocacy required a lot of kind of advocacy skills. Sorry, that's my dog in the background. But or so like I started just having to deal with a lot of people's myths and ideas about dyslexia specifically, and then later my older daughter was diagnosed with ADHD. So you have these kind of like ideas and preconceived notions that the teachers had as well, and then kind of having to break that down like no, she can read, it just takes her longer. You know, and like if we provide these assistive technologies for her, if we allow her to use speech to text software, then she can get her ideas out clearly. And so a lot of these kind of myths and ideas that I was having to kind of push back on with teachers, I ended up having kind of similar things when I would talk to people about email accessibility. They would kind of be like, oh, well, we have the view in browser button, so we don't need to make the emails accessible. And I was like, is that true? Like, I don't know if that's true. So kind of having a lot of that same kind of conversation and advocacy to kind of, and that kind of kept propelling me into like, well, is that true? Like, is the view in browser, the link, is that going to save accessibility somehow, and kind of digging into things, initially kind of piecemeal, and then eventually a little bit more methodical of actually like, having the screen readers available for testing in different email clients and stuff like that. So yeah, that might be a long-winded story, but that's kind of the experience that I've had.
It's very important to understand because of people. I had a very similar situation. The child of my friends, he is a boy. He didn't really like to read, and they pushed him to read, and he didn't know that it's hard for him to read because of he thinks the same for everybody. Till I read trying to investigate this area. Maybe the problem not in him, maybe the problem in dyslexia, which was the issue. And then they sorted out very quickly. And now he's reading books with some techniques and love books. Only thing we need to know that there are a lot of people with this kind of things. And yes, and before we start practical or theoretical part, I want to ask you another question from your LinkedIn.
Okay.
There is another quote. I think one of the reasons I dislike the word inclusion is because it's easy to throw into a side deck or talk track, but it's hard to do work to change so that space is truly inclusive. Yeah, it touched me a lot because of we are in Ukraine, and I understand how much work we have. Everybody say, okay, we like inclusive space, but it's not, and there's so many people who need this, and it's much easier to say than do real work. We had a case. Oh, long story. One day. Okay, later. So I very agree with it. Very agree with it. And the statistic from email markup consortium, they do from year to year. It's the second year they do this, and shows the terrible numbers that 99.9% of all HTML email they tested has a serious or critical accessibility issues that can be easily fixed, but they're not. So just can you share your expertise and role at Oracle, how you addressing these challenges? Because of everybody has the challenges.
Yeah, I mean, I think I always love the accessibility report that they put out. I think you were just saying earlier they're due to have another one out in the next handful of days, maybe, hopefully. But I think I think it's hard to kind of take a kind of global approach to it because I think there's so many variations and so many reasons why brands really do struggle with accessibility. Even just from a straightforward like image versus live text situation. I also see a lot of like color contrast issues. I always see alt text issues. Apologies if you are connected to me on Slack in any way. I tend to like screenshot emails that I get and post them all the time because they're just really bad. A lot of placeholders. But I think in general, like there's still definitely a lot of work to be done. But I definitely love seeing the brands that are really focused on it, that are, doing that work to make sure that they're getting all of their content to all of their users is such a critical and important thing that needs to happen in the industry as a whole. So yeah.
Yeah, great. So I will ask you to do the following. Please share your slides. I know that you prepared some slides, and we will return back when you're done to discuss some particular stuff. Okay?
Okay, sounds good.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right, hi guys. So we're going to talk about some of my kind of top email accessibility tips, specifically for folks using Stripo or anything that is more front-facing and not getting deep into the code stuff. And I like to start by talking about assistive technology. I think in the email world and kind of in the digital accessibility world in general, we tend to talk a lot about assistive technology as screen readers, but there's really a whole lot more users than just screen reader users. In fact, the definition of assistive technology is quite a bit broader. Essentially, if someone with a disability uses something to compensate for their disability, that thing is assistive technology. So for my daughter with ADHD, Post-it notes or a planner is going to be her assistive technology. And that planner can be a paper planner, it can be an iPad planner. And then we have hearing aids, wheelchairs, all kinds of different assistive technologies exist. And I think it's important to note that it is the person using the item that makes it assistive technology. And then I think from there, we kind of can talk about specific assistive technologies and exactly how people with disabilities use them when they're using email, and that gets into kind of a whole other different category. So the most common assistive technology on the planet is actually a smartphone. We've got an iPhone here, but my Android also has a lot of the same or similar assistive technologies built into the operating system and also available as third-party programs. So there really is an extremely diverse selection of assistive technologies that exist that are not related to just screen readers. So I think that's kind of an important excuse me, an important place to start. There it goes. But I also do like to focus on assistive technologies. Sorry, wow. Okay, so when we're talking about screen readers, it's important to know that there really are a lot of different screen readers. So we've got VoiceOver, TalkBack, NVDA, Narrator, JAWS. There's basically kind of these 6 or 7 main screen readers. And then there's a whole bunch of other ones that are used for usually specific purposes or due to other preferences. And if you kind of think of this, right, we have, these handful of screen readers, and then we have, our kind of core email clients that are most popular, that are used by the most amount of people. And we're really kind of multiplying those together and talking about the different experiences of each person. So you might be on Gmail on your laptop. That could be a PC or a Mac. You could be using, any of the 3 main screen readers on a PC or VoiceOver on a Mac. And so we have a lot of variation there. And what I've found through testing is that each of those screen reader and email combinations actually gives a different output. Sorry, my dog is screaming at me. I'm trying to manage. So I think it's really kind of important to note that, if you test on one screen reader, you've tested on one screen reader in one email client, maybe, a handful. I mean, we're all email marketers. I feel like we all have a couple of different email clients out there that we have on our various devices for doing live testing. But I think it's really important to kind of wrap your head around that testing it on one screen reader is going to be different. Testing on one device is going to be different. The exact way that it reads out content is going to be different. Which attributes it will read out are going to be different. And so there's kind of a lot of variation there. And especially in the email world, I think when we're talking about websites, like more web-focused accessibility, it gets a little simpler as far as, we can all expect that the ARIA label is going to be read out when we don't have that same kind of standardization in email. All right, there we go. All right, so I really like talking about alternative text. It's one of my favorite things to talk about. I talk about it all the time, and it's one of the things that I think is so critical in the email world, where we have um, so many images that come across my inbox that don't have any alt text, and it is kind of a chronic problem. So I like to kind of talk about it and talk about what we can do different. So I think talking first of all about the vocabulary of it, we have um, two terms that are used interchangeably a lot. So we have the alt attribute, which is quite literally the HTML attribute alt equals that goes inside an image element. And then we have the alternative text, which is the text that goes inside that alt attribute. I like to kind of separate them out because I think a lot of times we just say alt text, and they're not exactly the same, but generally speaking, people tend to use them interchangeably, and that's fine. I also like to talk about who uses alt text because we really have historically in email only focused on one group of people, and that is people whose images don't load, and making sure that visually that alt text looks good. Like I even remember back in the day when we used images as buttons, and making sure that if that button image was turned off, that the alt text behind it looks nice, like looks like the buttons. Like I distinctly remember learning how to do that. But we have this whole other group of people, people that actually use alt text to gain information about the content, people that use assistive technology like screen readers, that actually have a legal requirement to that alt attribute. So that is like legally required content for them. So in one group we have legal requirement, and the other group we have nice to have. And so I think it's important that we understand that alt text is not a nice to have. I also like pointing out what happens when we don't have an alt attribute, because I see this a lot in the emails that come across my inbox where, you know, folks don't have any alt attribute. And there's really kind of three variations. Remember when I was talking about the different devices and the different email clients and the different screen readers and kind of how we have different readouts for each of those. So there's really kind of three main ways this is going to be read out. So if you don't have an alt attribute on an unlinked image, oftentimes the screen reader will read out that entire URL, like the hosted URL for that image, which is really long and painful if you've ever read one of those. I've got two examples down below this image here. And then other times they might just read the actual file name, which is fine if the file name is irrelevant, but at least for myself, most of the time, if I'm exporting an image, it doesn't really have a relevant name to that product. It's usually like related to the company. And then also a linked image, which most of our images in email are, usually that's going to be the worst experience because the user is going to get the entire link read out. And that usually includes tracking information, UTF codes, all of that good stuff. So that ends up being really long and really, really awful. I also have been in places that have firewalls that will also change that link as well. So even if it starts out as relevant, it might have additional content in it that just makes it really painful. So I think it's sorry, important to understand that these alt attributes really are critical, and that you really just have to have an alt attribute in every image. Like it's a requirement, and it's a horrible experience for users that don't have that experience. And then there's really a couple of things that I like to kind of high level talk about when we're talking about alt text. So one is the content. So that's basically what's in the image, what the image is communicating. And then the context is what is the information around that image saying? Because we don't want that information to be the same as the information around it. We kind of want to be aware of that. So I have these kind of like 8 top best practices. So we want to match the content. And that can be as simple as, obviously, if you have text in an image, which we don't really want to use, but if you have to for whatever reason, we want that text to be represented one for one from the image. So whatever the image says, we want the alt text to say. We also want to make sure that we're communicating what that image is communicating. So if that image is of a specific product, we want to make sure that we're calling out that that is an image of that product. You also want to be aware of character limits. So a lot of screen readers will stop reading at around 120, 125 characters. That doesn't seem to be as true these days, but I think that it's still critical to kind of focus the bulk of the content in those first 120 characters and make sure that you're saying what needs to be said. You also don't need to include image of or graphic of because the screen reader will actually read it that way. It will say that this is an image and then read the alt text. So you kind of become redundant and you're taking up some of those 120 characters. You also don't want to match case. So if your image has text in it that's all caps, we do not want that alt text to be all caps. We usually want sentence case or title case. We also want to make sure that that text is accurate, equivalent, and succinct. So basically, we want to make it as short and clear as possible. And then again, considering the context, if you have a photo of a product and the name of the product right next to it, that can cause some redundancy if you're going to use the photos, or if you're going to have the photos alt text be the name of the product, because then it's going to be read as product name. So just kind of think about what information is already outside of that image and make sure that that image content then is relevant. I always like to point out color contrast because it is quite literally the biggest failure point in every email I've ever looked at. I think I've only had one client who has not had color contrast problems. It's a big deal. So make sure you're making sure that the color contrast in your graphics is meeting those requirements as well. And then redundancy, kind of like when we were talking about the context, we want to make sure that the information that we're providing in that alt text is not repeating other information on the page, just because that is somewhat useless information. How many times do you have to hear the headline? How many times do you have to hear the name of the product? It's just not useful, not helpful to be redundant. Then I like talking about link purpose and distinction. So we're really talking about how to make sure that the text that we're writing on a link and the way that the link looks is accessible. So I think it's important to kind of think about how people with disabilities use links generally. And so we're kind of talking about, kind of the top 3 use cases, but there's really an almost infinite number of use cases on how people use links. So when we're talking about keyboard navigators, and a lot of times people confuse keyboard navigators and screen reader users, there is a lot of overlap there, but there is actually a distinction between someone using a keyboard to navigate the screen and someone using a screen reader. So keyboard navigator usually will use the tab key or the K key to jump through the links on a page. And that's pretty typical. That's like a pretty common use case if you're navigating by keyboard. I find myself using it often when I'm just trying to get to something important or just kind of hop along the page. So it's kind of important to realize that means that those links are sometimes going to be out of context, if that makes sense. So if you're jumping from link to link to link, if all 3 of those links say learn more, you're not going to know what you need to learn more about. Screen reader users are similar. They can also pull up a window of different links. Again, the text in that link is going to be what gets pulled up on that window. So again, if you're learn more, they're not going to know where that link is going to go. And that's really an important thing that's necessary. You also need to consider users with mobility issues. I think a lot about a friend of mine's dad who has Parkinson's and how hard of a time he has actually clicking on links on websites. So in those situations, we're really thinking about those CTA buttons, images, the little social icons at the bottom of the page, making sure that those are accessible and able to be clicked on is critical. And so kind of going into that a little bit more, what I consider like link best practices. So we want to make sure that we're distinguishing our links. And so that means that the visual appearance on the page is clear that that is a link in some way. Obviously, the most common way to do that is to underline text. And it's also part of why we don't want to underline text that is not linked. But also, basically any kind of formatting is going to be useful here. But I generally try to stick with the more standard underline. You also don't want to use color only for our colorblind folks, which is a lot of people. If the only difference between the text is the color and they can't see that color, then you're not truly distinguishing and separating the link from the rest of the content. Also related, color contrast. If you are using a color as part of that way that you're distinguishing that link, you want to make sure that the color has appropriate color contrast between the foreground and the background. And then when we're talking about our users with mobility issues, we also want to make sure that that link is big enough to be selected. There are some pretty specific rules about how big that link needs to be. I believe the latest is 24 pixels, so you want to make sure that a 24 pixel square is able to be clicked on, and even that is pretty small. So that would be the bare minimum. You also want to make sure that the link text, when we were talking about users that use the keyboard to navigate and how they go from link to link to link, and how learn more isn't going to be helpful for them. We want to make sure that we're providing more information in that link so that we can take that link out of context and still understand what it's saying. One of the ways that we can do that is actually by applying an ARIA label to that link. It doesn't have wonderful support on email clients, but I think that it is a worthwhile endeavor to try to have some way to give users additional context. Also, writing good alt text. So when we're linking an image, making sure that the alt text for that image also describes where that link is going is super critical. And also, I like to point out reducing your links as much as possible. So I think a lot of times, in email, we want to link everything in an email because we want every single thing to be tracked. We want to know if they touched or if they clicked on the image or the CTA or this link or that link. What was the most important aspect to get this link clicked. But what we found with users is that when we link everything, that can get very confusing for users. They can accidentally click on something while scrolling. They can do just a lot of stuff that is quite challenging to do. So kind of reducing that link discrepancy, I think, is really, really important and critical. Let's see. Also, color contrast. So I've talked a little bit about color contrast in both the images and the text already, but color contrast is critical. So when we think about CTAs, I think are a perfect example because we have specific thresholds that we need to meet for the text in the CTA, the color of that CTA button, and then also the background color. So we have just really specific color contrast ratios that we have to meet for those. And when we don't, users with color blindness can really have a hard time reading it. So I'd like to think no one would ever put that horrible teal on a red, but if you did, just know that that is almost impossible to read in other situations, right? So you want to kind of match that. I have these two links here that are really great color contrast checkers that will, you can put the hex code of those color values in there and it will tell you if you're meeting those color contrast requirements. There's also some additional requirements for text size. So smaller text has a higher ratio requirement than larger text because once it gets larger, it's easier to read kind of automatically. And so that's pretty critical. Then I like to talk about text fonts and formatting, because I think that that's another one that is easy for us to do kind of on the onset and then not really have to mess with it too much afterwards. So when I talk about kind of text-based practices, my biggest one is not to use all caps. And so I talked about that a bit with the alt text too. So when a screen reader gets to an all caps situation where the text is all caps, it generally will read out that text. So it basically spells out each letter as if it were an acronym. Sometimes some of those are known, and so the screen reader can read them appropriately. But because that's a gray area, and because I don't think anybody wants to test all of those, it's just best case to not use all caps. And that does include using the text transform property. I've had a number of people think that was like a good hack to get out of it, but unfortunately the screen reader reads the content, it doesn't read the CSS. So you also want to be really careful about your font choice. I had a client a handful of years ago that picked a font that ended up looking really, really thin, like was almost upsettingly thin on Outlook. But on everywhere else, it looked fine. It met color contrast requirements. But they ended up getting a note from a user with low vision that they could not read it in the one specific version of Outlook that presented with that thin font. So kind of be aware of that. And that does also impact the color contrast requirements as well. Obviously, if you have a thinner font, you might meet those color contrast requirements in the calculator, but it still might not quite have the contrast that it needs. And then also kind of related, being aware of those fallback fonts too. A lot of times we might have a branded font that is just kind of bigger than a fallback font. And so what meets that 18 pixel bold requirement for color contrast ratios might actually fall down a little bit and not quite work as well on a fallback font. So kind of be aware of that and be aware of how the fallback fonts work. We also don't want to center align our text. That has pretty horrible experiences for users with dyslexia, low vision. Being able to follow the text while it kind of moves essentially in the center alignment is just incredibly challenging. Same with font size. We want to make sure our body text is usually about 16 pixels, which can kind of feel a little big if you're not used to it, but definitely is improving the readability for a lot of users there. We also want to avoid inaccessible formatting, which is really kind of interesting. There's actually a study that talked about how I think it was a sans serif font set in bold and italic is one of the hardest things to read. So if that is one of your style choices, make sure that you are at the very least kind of beefing that text up so it's a little bigger and easier to read, and maybe just trying to reduce that as much as possible and just not using that formatting type. Also, when you are kind of styling your content, a lot of times we want our text to lay out in a very specific way. So we'll use line breaks or a hard return to make it look good on the page. But a lot of times that causes some issues for screen reader users and for users that use a zoom tool to zoom in on that content, because that's going to change the flow of the text. And then I think we've all seen what happens when you use a hard return and something moves in a desktop, all of a sudden the text is laid out really horribly. So we don't want to use that. And then color contrast, like we were kind of talking about a bit ago with the font choice. We want to make sure that our color contrast is meeting those ratios on text, on CTAs, on images, on graphics. Everything really needs to have good color contrast. So that is very critical. And that is it. So yeah, I think that is the kind of crux of our accessibility focus when we're talking about like the visual front end aspects of accessibility. And hello.
Yeah. Thank you very much. We have several questions, but before I allow, I will use my host privilege and first will ask my questions, because of I found that I have a lot of accessibility mistakes. for product cards, when we do automation, we always put by default alt text and title the same as a header or uploads, because of what else we have to put there. It's just easy way to automate. But you say it's wrong because of the duplicating the context and the type alternative text of image.
I
We
actually
have,
was, sorry. Oh, I
yeah,
was
yeah,
just
we
gonna
have
say,
to really, we have
sorry,
to,
go.
we have to rebuild our strategy, because if we do this for years, and I always thought them very clever to do this. It's not. Okay.
Yeah, actually, I was just on a call with a client earlier this week about that exact same issue, where we had an image and a product name and then a CTA to buy that product, and their accessibility team was like, we can't do this, like this is not good. So kind of having to brainstorm some other solutions to help them find a better way to solve that same problem. It's really fascinating how many things I think that we just kind of do because we don't know what else to do. And that's kind of why I started talking about it so much, is because I want to make sure that people at least are well informed that they're making their own choice.
Yeah. Another thing, I think it's kind of conflict with, I would say, controversial like best practices, that every image you have, if it's real image, not just pixel, tracking pixel, add the link, because of people click everywhere. Just the idea when you email to transfer user into your site. So they selling the links. It's not always selling the conversion, because of also site sells it. So as you said, it's a bad idea to put a lot of links. Only links where it's required. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. I like to use the term intentional linking strategy. So we're not just, I feel like we take like a shotgun approach to it and just, sorry for the American metaphor, but having links everywhere versus like being really careful and kind of strategic about where we're linking and what we really want to know about what our users are interested in, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I see. And also, I'm a right understanding. So first, we have to reduce number of links. Not every image has to be linked. And it's different strategy for alternative text for image that linked, because of it have to reflect the target place, yeah? And for image that doesn't have a link, and it have to describe what's in the image, not what's in the context. Am I right?
Yeah, I mean, it kind of ends up depending on a number of different factors, right? Exactly what is linked, exactly what the context around it is. So there is going to be some variation in almost every different situation. But generally, yeah, like when you're linking an image, you do have to share where that link is going. And then when you're talking about just the text in a button or a link, a text link, you have that same requirement. It just can be worded a little differently when you're talking about something that's like visually available to the users as well.
I see. It's very interesting. Thank you. And we have several questions. One in our YouTube. One from Alexander. What advice would you give to organizations that are just starting to focus on email accessibility?
Oh, sure. So I guess, let's see, if you're starting, I think kind of these design front-end focused things are going to be the most critical. So I would definitely say like making sure that you're hitting that color contrast requirement and making sure that you're putting alt text in your images is going to be super important. Like those are going to be the easiest things to start with. And then I think after that, you can start working on actual coding strategies and kind of simplifying your coding, making sure that your code is meeting best practices. I would say that's probably the easiest place to start, is just with the color contrast and the images. And then I also say, like, turn on the screen reader on your device and actually listen to what your email sounds like when it's read, because I think that that is such a a way to kind of humanize the experience. I think to really kind of understand what that experience is like, and don't go hog wild. I had a friend who took this advice very literally and then wanted to fix how every single part of the email was read. It You're gaining the experience, the understanding. You're not doing any wild testing by just trying it out, right? I've run out of treats for my dog, so he might start crying.
Can you suggest any screen reader or tools you recommend for testing?
So I think there's a lot of really good tools out there. I'm always hesitant about the automated checkers because I think they're really great tools, but they don't really meet the whole of, like, you can't just run something through a checker and know that it's accessible. But like I really like the accessibility checker on Parcel specifically is really great. Litmus's accessibility checker I think also does a good job for catching kind of the big stuff. But I always feel a little wary when people are asking for accessibility checkers, because I think it's important to note that, like, they're super helpful, but they're not going to be, like, if that's all you're doing for accessibility, you're going to miss a lot.
So you have to close eyes and try to click on the link.
Oh gosh, no. I mean, I think that's helpful, again, to like kind of learn and understand the experience. But I think as far as like the really big testing, generally speaking, that's not super necessary if you're following best practices.
Okay, thank you. We have another question. So,
Okay.
how has your approach to accessibility evolved over the years? So,
Oh, for sure. I mean, I remember when I first started getting into accessibility, I did what probably everyone does, of just reading a lot, seeing what literature was already out there, and kind of starting from there, and then kind of from there learning more. I think getting the certifications that I did was a really helpful next step. So I did the CPAC, which is through the International Accessibility Professionals. I'm skipping a letter there. But that's really helpful, I think, in kind of better understanding the broader concepts of disability. And then the Trusted Tester, which is a US certification, but I believe that it's open internationally. But that also takes you through a really specific testing process and kind of learning exactly what you're looking for each of those different checklist guidelines, and it's really, really helpful as well.
yeah, thank you. We have another question we mentioned a little bit, but from Leila. Interactive elements can be tricky for screen readers. How do you ensure that such elements are accessible and understandable?
Well, functionally, there really isn't a way to make them accessible. I actually spent a lot of time last year really kind of digging into interactive components. And there are some changes you can make to get them almost there, but you can never kind of cross that final threshold into being fully accessible. So one of the kind of bigger things that I learned was that the ARIA label really doesn't work on interactive elements in an email the same way it does on web elements. In fact, on websites, the ARIA label is used for interactive elements, but it doesn't work that way at all in email. And instead, I found that I had to kind of change the kind of standard way that I was coding to use more images with alt text in order to provide that kind of ARIA label. But the short answer is don't use interactive elements. They really can't work. I did create an accessible slider that does meet accessibility standards, but is pretty complicated. So I think it's important to know that just kind of baseline interactive elements are not going to be accessible, and to kind of plan accordingly. So making sure that if you're going to use interactive elements, that those emails, that the content inside that interactive element is not critical. for users to understand. You can have fun with it. I don't think I'm ever going to convince people to not use interactive elements, but they're not accessible.
Yeah, I agree with you. But when we speak about interactive elements, it's not only accessibility, it's also a lot of different, if we speak for normal emails about responsive emails and normal emails, when we speak about interactive emails, it means that in Outlook, it works in one way, in Gmail other way, in Apple Mail other way, and it has to be fallback. And maybe we have to think about like a contrast for any kind of a content. But people who cannot interact with interactive content, I think they receive the plain text version. So you have also care about all kind of fallback.
That is a common thought process, but it's not accurate actually. Any person with any disability can get the interactive content. I think there's also always this idea that low vision or blind or screen reader users are going to always get the plain text email, but that is not really the case. So for the most part, there is no fallback. You are giving that interactive content to users with disabilities. It's an unfortunate reality, and that's why it's important that they be accessible if they can be, and that you use them sparingly. Well, really, you shouldn't use them at all if you want to be accessible. But again, I don't think I'm going to stop people from using them.
For sure. But I mean, maybe for people with some restriction, maybe they have, some special email clients that adopt HTML in a way they can easily read. So they don't, when you send email to Gmail, it shows different HTML, not the same HTML as we send because of its replacement.
Yeah, that's
maybe
that processing.
Anything like this for accessibility, for like special email clients we have to test or not?
I mean, that's definitely a lot of what I work on testing is kind of the end result of, once those have been processed through specific email clients. And that's part of what makes the kind of when I was talking about screen readers, the kind of combination of different screen readers and different email clients is going to have a different output, because like to your broader point, we're not just getting that HTML as it was sent. We're getting it how it's processed through those email clients, and then the screen reader is picking up specific elements of that processed code and then reading that, and that doesn't always translate to something that's accessible. I don't know if that helps, but it is just a fairly complicated mix of things, and I think that a lot of times the way that we think something works isn't really the way that something works. So
it is complicated, but we still have a few questions.
Of course, sorry.
I read that links should be, it's from Layla, sorry if I think wrong. I read that links should be descriptive instead of always writing learn more or something like that. But we don't like the links that have a long text. What can you advise?
So I think that's where the ARIA label on a link comes in really handy. So that ARIA label is going to replace the text that's in that link. So if you have a visual learn more, that ARIA label can say learn more about, running shoes or whatever. And then the user, well, specifically a screen reader user, will get that content instead of the visual content. Best practice is actually to use a longer CTA and try to make it as concise as possible, which isn't easy, but that is the best practice. So kind of making sure that you are providing more descriptive link text.
Yeah. So more best practice, usually best practice is more focused to conversion, not referring to accessibility. But now we will fix it. Another question from Victoria. Are there any specific coding practices you follow to ensure compatibility with a variety of screen readers?
Sure. So when I'm coding, it definitely goes into a different kind of different realm, because we're a lot of times when we're coding emails, we're not using semantics, right? The kind of broader web world does not still code designs in tables. So we're kind of taking something that has a specific purpose with data and putting it into a method that it's not supposed to use. So that's kind of not semantic. So a lot of times, most of what we're doing on the coding side is trying to kind of fix those semantic issues. So we'll add role presentation to each of those tables to help the screen reader understand that we are using this table for layout, for presentation. And then also when we're writing text, making sure that we're sticking with semantic text elements too, like headings and paragraphs, lists and things like that. So yeah, that can get pretty deep and go pretty far, but it's definitely, I think, worth doing and worth pursuing, but is a little bit more learning and diving into kind of what works and what doesn't.
Yeah, thank you. And I think we have another last question for now. Sarah, for linking non-declarative images in emails, do you apply both the area label and alt text?
So I never apply an ARIA label to an image, because the alt is we want the end result is what we call an accessible name. So what the name of that item is, and the alt text does that much better than the ARIA label ever can. And when you have the ARIA label and the alt text, they compete for which gets read. And you run into a number of kind of redundancy issues with that, like process issues. So just use the alt attribute exclusively when you're talking about images. But when you're talking about a linked decorative image, you can't have an empty alt attribute. You do need to define what that image is or where that link is going in some way. And that's kind of where we get into a bit of a more cerebral question, I feel like, is, does a decorative image need to be linked? And I would say no, it doesn't. And then if you have to link it, then you have to apply alt text to it. That alt text needs to define where that link is going, and also some kind of additional information. I mean, I suppose if you have to stick with where the link is going, but yeah, so that's kind of the baseline. Don't link it if you can get away with that, because that would be the best case. And then if you have to link it, then you do have to provide alt attribute, and don't use ARIA label on images. So yeah, those are my answers.
Thank you. Yeah, sorry, I know that your dog needs you too. So I promise it's the last question for me. Like in the very beginning, like we mentioned the word inclusion. Like let's talk about the difference between inclusive in design and accessibility. I know that it's kind of very similar, but what is the difference?
No. So I think it's really important. I think there's a lot of if you kind of think of a Venn diagram of inclusive and accessible, there's definitely a lot of overlap there. And I think that a lot of people use the two terms interchangeably. I don't love that idea, because I think that accessibility is a legal right, whereas inclusive is kind of like a PR warm fuzzy, which is maybe a pretty gross simplification on both sides. But I do think that being an inclusive is good, and it's a wonderful goal to have. But I also think understanding that accessibility is a human right really kind of changes that perspective a little bit. Sorry. He's so funny.
Thank you very much. And yes, first of all, I want again say thank you, and it's a pleasure for having you. Thank you for answering all the questions. We have another question, but sorry, we are out of time. And it was, by the way, it was a question. Can we share the presentation with our listeners? So if we can, we will send in our follow-up and maybe in a comment in the chat.
Mhm.
Can we do this?
You definitely can on my side. I'm not sure if that's for me or Alexandra.
Okay,
Fine.
so
Fine.
done. We agree. And
Okay.
again, thank you for participating today. And how to say, happy Global Accessibility Awareness Day. Let's all our communication be simple. We hate to say this, but let's all emails be, not only emails, inclusive. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sarah.
Thank you.
And I would like to say that may all the 365 days of the year be Global Accessibility Awareness Day. Thank you so much, and have a great day. Bye-bye.
Bye, guys.